again, I'm probably gonna have to disagree with him. I think I would place this much higher. And so far, I've actually arguably probably disagreed with everything he said. This video wasn't even requested, but I saw this pop up on my TikTok the other day and I was thinking, wow, what a great opportunity to discuss some bits and also highlight that just because you have loads of followers doesn't necessarily mean you know everything. And we're actually going to be looking at Athlean-X, where he ranks quad exercises best to worst.
In the worst of the worst category, and we're talking about the sissy squat. And maybe some of you have never even seen the exercise before, and that's probably a good thing.
Immediately, I'm not going to back it. I think ultimately this video he said he created with the context of hypertrophy in mind, so the building of muscle, which is very much my kind of realm. So I get to talk about that and give justifications as to why I disagree with what he's saying here. The sissy squat, I think ultimately I'm going to go over this based on the assumption that everyone who's watching this video is healthy and without injuries. So with the sissy squat, ultimately it is one of the few movements that allows you to effectively lengthen the rec fem, which is a muscle of the quads, obviously the quads being 4 muscles, the rec fem is one of them, and not many movements really allow that. You look at squat patterns, for example, the rec fem is going to get neglected. Ultimately, if you really want to train the rec fem effectively, you're going to be looking at the leg extension and the sissy squat. Again, if you're healthy and able to do so, I think the sissy squat is a really great movement I would probably pair with a leg extension near the end of a workout.
And that brings us to the next in the worst category, and this time we're talking about the squat. But hold off, we're not talking about just any squat, we're talking about the Smith machine squat, because this is not the way to squat. We understand that the best path for the bar on a squat is vertical, but doing it on a Smith machine is going to force your verticality to happen in a way that you don't want it to.
The Smith machine is one of the movements that allows you to squat in the most vertical manner, because essentially it goes up and down largely. But realistically, if you adjust foot placement and are pretty mobile, you're going to be able to squat with a pretty upright torso, which, that being said, upright torso isn't necessarily massively relevant to quad development. Knee flexion is. The Smith machine being an extremely stable movement that you can progressively overload well, that takes you through a range of motion you actually kind of want to go through if you're looking at maximizing quad hypertrophy. So again, I'm actually going to disagree. I would actually flip both of them and say they're actually probably up there with either some of the best or the best movements.
And we start off with the dumbbell drop squat. And this is actually one of my favorite ways to do a squat, especially for beginners.
He's putting this movement above like the Smith machine squat, when realistically, when you're looking at a movement like this, there are going to be so many external variables that can limit your ability to progressively overload this well, such as your lower back's going to give out. In this case, your grip is definitely going to give out before your legs do. Range of motion is going to be limited. I think ultimately, if you're looking at maximizing quad development, you want to be able to take the quads through as much of a range of motion as possible, which means maximizing knee flexion, which is the bendy of the knees. You can't do so with this movement. Your range of motion is limited. And considering the quads are arguably hyper responders to stretch mediated hypertrophy, that then indicates that going to those really lengthened positions, so the bottom of a squat pattern perhaps, is going to be really good for building the quad muscles.
And that's where heavy resistance bike or hill riding steps in as an amazing quad builder. If you just watch the Tour de France, you'll see that even guys with somewhat slight upper body development will have pretty massive lower bodies, in quads in particular.
Is this massive lower body development due to the cycling, or is this massive lower body development largely due to the amount of training they are doing external to the cycling to help develop the quads and the muscles they're going to be driving a lot of power through when cycling? Chris Hoy, for example, who's a very successful cyclist, back in the day would film videos of him doing Bulgarian split squats and squats with absurd amounts of weight, highlighting that he is training the quads effectively outside of cycling to then build a muscle, because a bigger muscle has the potential to be a stronger muscle, to then use that additional muscle mass and potentially additional output of force in the sports he's looking to compete in. So essentially he's getting bigger and stronger outside of the sport to then be able to exert more power for longer within the sport. Jeff is highlighting or suggesting that the cyclists were developing mass amounts of quad muscle purely due to cycling, when that's likely not the case.
We're talking about the leg extension, and yes, it's in my better category. Why? Well, by my own criteria, if you're looking for an exercise that can create hypertrophy, specifically in the quads, and is capable of being overloaded, well, it would have to fall here. Except I still have my issues with the exercise from an overall safety standpoint.
I think people with existing knee issues may find any exercise troublesome. I've had knee problems before where I couldn't squat but I could leg extension. I've had knee problems before where I could leg extension but I couldn't squat. Ultimately, you have to kind of standardize your approach when you're making videos like this by stating, I'm going to go off the assumption, like I did earlier, that everybody is healthy and without knee problems or without injuries in general. Is that realistic? Potentially not. But if I then take into account every different injury, I then have to take into account how that could impact every exercise, and arguably that would leave potentially many exercises, depending on the injury, redundant. With the idea that people are healthy, realistically, the leg extension is a fantastic movement. It's arguably one of the only movements you can actually utilize to shorten the rec fem, which again is that muscle of the quads that is largely neglected through squat patterns. Would I use this as a primary movement? No, but if I'm developing a well-structured quad workout, more often than not, it's going to include a leg extension variation of sorts.
The leg press. And this is once again one of those exercises I think there's far better options, but I'm not going to discredit its ability to help you to grow bigger quads.
I think the leg press is a fantastic quad builder, again depending on how you do it. Jeff did make a fair point there, you want to go low and narrow with the feet. I completely agree, because this is going to allow you to maximize knee flexion, which means you're going to essentially maximize how involved the quads are. The leg press is arguably one of my favorite movements because it really works the quads quite effectively, depending on how you do it, in their mid-range, and you can actually take them through a pretty wild range of motion if you have the mobility to do so without too many risks, provided you are doing so with correct technique. But again, I'm probably going to have to disagree with him. I think I would place this much higher, and so far I've actually arguably probably disagreed with everything he said. TFNL community coaching is always a thing, and this is always linked down below in the description and the comment section, in which I kind of write programs for people and you follow them as a community, as a team, and we go through and we talk about things as it goes. There's a message board and stuff, you can comment on the sessions, I can get involved and jump in as well. And we're actually due to start a new block, a new training cycle in the next few weeks, which is going to be very exciting. And as always, it likely costs less than your Netflix subscription. The TFNL growth guide, which is always linked down below in the description as well, which is a handy workout resource to give you lots of information surrounding how to train effectively, including 30 weeks of programming with a home workout add-on coming very soon.
We have the dumbbell step up, because I look at this as one of the more functional quad exercises. But more than that, it does a really good job of effectively hitting the quads. As long as you maintain that upright posture.
Again, the posture is not going to be as relevant as you think. Sure, posture does play a part of it, but what's really going to matter is your degree of knee flexion. I think ultimately the step up is good. It's a good movement. I'd probably put it as like mid-tier like he has here. Again, stability is a consideration, which is obviously going to limit how well you can overload it. He spoke about this from a functional standpoint, but that's not the purpose of this video. He even said he's looking at this from the context of hypertrophy. Therefore, functional aspects of movements shouldn't necessarily be considered, as that's not the purpose of this video.
But definitely not one to be overlooked if you're looking for bigger quads. It's the sled push or pull.
Yeah, in fairness, I do think the sled push or pull can be good. If you're looking at it from like a knee health standpoint, I think reverse walking with a sled can actually be really good. If you're looking at it from like a slightly different approach to quad training, I do think there are definitely going to be some hypertrophy benefits behind sled pushes and whatnot. But again, would I favor it over something like a leg press perhaps? Probably not, although I would certainly consider programming it depending on the goal and depending on the individual. So I do think it definitely does have some merit in the realm of hypertrophy.
And the first exercise I want to point out here is the hack squat. And not only is this the one that sort of shines whenever we do any kind of EMG studies, but it's just a pretty effective quad targeting exercise.
I would actually argue that the hack squat or similar variations like the hack squat or pendulum squat perhaps, arguably some of the best, if not the best quad builders, especially when looking at that lengthened range. So essentially, they give you all the benefits of like a back squat that you typically want, being range of motion, being overload, loads of things, without the worry about stability and safety. Essentially, if you're going to fail a back squat, you're probably a bit concerned for your safety. If you fail a hack squat or a pendulum squat, you're probably okay. Again, this very much falls into the category of like vertical squat patterns, and I do think the hack squat is bloody fantastic, and again is arguably one of my favorite quad builders.
Next up in the almost best category is honestly one of my favorite exercises. We're talking about the dumbbell Bulgarian split squat. And I understand that most people don't really love the exercise, but it's really effective at hitting those quads.
Yeah, actually, no, I would agree. I think the split squat is a fantastic movement. Again, stability is a consideration, something that many people may struggle with, but as a whole, the split squat is a really good movement. Despite me having personal issues with the movement itself, and despite us having a troublesome relationship, it is a good movement if you can overload it well and actually take it to, if not close to failure well, which is actually something a lot of people may struggle to do. And it's comparative to like a unilateral leg press, depending on how you place your feet.
The back squat is back as one of our almost best, but a particular kind of back squat. We're talking about the high bar variation.
I do think the back squat is good. I think the high bar back squat is a good quad builder, but again, is it my favorite? Probably not. I would likely favor something like a pendulum squat or a hack squat for the additional stability benefits that they provide. Beyond that, like I developed some pretty okay legs, back squatting a lot when I was powerlifting, but I think there are probably some deficits to my training where I could have maybe developed better legs if I were able to push myself a bit harder, a bit more safely, without consideration of failure and crushing myself to death, basically.
I'm gonna give it a tie, because I wanna give the green star to both of these exercises because they're gonna do the same thing in a little bit different way. Let's start with the front squat. The front squat is going to be the premier variation of the squat.
I don't know if I necessarily agree. I think ultimately the belt squat is more of a mid-position quad movement, whereas the front squat might well be a more lengthened position quad movement. Therefore, they're not really doing the same thing at all. The front squat, I think, is actually going to be further limited by things like core strength and stability, by your shoulders and other external variables that may hit failure before your quads do, therefore limiting how effective that movement is for developing the quads. But the belt squat flip around, I think, is a fantastic movement. Big fan if you do it properly and don't use your arms to leverage yourself up too much. There's always been this big idea that the front squat is going to be far superior for the quads due to the more upright torso and the anterior loading of the movement than like a back squat. Ultimately, you've got to think about range of motion, knee flexion, things like that. If you can achieve the same range of motion and degree of knee flexion in a front squat versus a back squat, which one can you progressively overload more and which one is going to involve less limiting factors? Probably the back squat. Therefore, I would probably favor that. I personally don't front squat, and I rarely program front squats for many of my clients, but again, that's very goal dependent. I think ultimately Jeff's idea and his approach to this was like the best and the worst, when I don't necessarily think there is a best and a worst. I have my favorites and my least favorites, but I think whether you determine something to be the best or the worst depends on a lot of variables. Goals, abilities, injuries, etc., etc. We've kind of identified that we're not necessarily considering injuries and stuff. We're looking at more goals, which are going to be hypertrophy dominant, so that's one thing. But then you also look at like other variations. I think ultimately, if the quads are hyper responders to stretch mediated hypertrophy, then by default, will you argue that length and position quad movements like the hack squat and whatnot might be the best movements, but then working them in the short and the mid range is also going to be effective. So the best movements for the mid range might be like a leg press, for example, and the best movement for the shortened range might be a leg extension, for example. So when you say that blanket term of best and worst, is best and worst for what? I don't necessarily agree with the placement of this is the best and this is the worst, because like I said, it depends on too many things, and there are also too many variables to consider what it could be the best or the worst for. I think ultimately one of the big things you have to look at is whatever your movement you're doing going to help you reach your goals. Can you do so safely and effectively? Can you progressively overload that movement to then help you reach those goals? And also, do you actually enjoy those movements? It's all well and good me saying, oh, do the hack squat, the leg press and the leg extension to work the quads in their length and mid and short and range and have a really good quad workout. But if you hate all three of those movements, you're probably not going to do them to the best of your abilities. Therefore, that actually limits how effective they are, because enjoyment is very important when considering adherence. So again, this is what I mean by just because someone has a load of followers doesn't necessarily mean you should inherently trust everything they're saying. I think a lot of people place a lot of trust in larger creators because they have such a following, but sometimes creators actually develop more of a name for themselves, not because they're telling you what you need to hear, but sometimes maybe because they're telling you what you want to hear. And also their justifications behind why something is good or bad may sound good, but is it accurate and is it supported? As a whole, I think Jeff does know some good stuff. I don't disagree with that, but he's probably actually not one of my favorite creators to follow, because I think there's some outdated information in there, and I think his justifications behind why certain things are good or bad, although you could technically argue whether something's good or bad either way, don't align with the things I've read via research, the things I've experienced via myself and clients, and also just my preferences in general behind my own justifications as being a formulation of, like I said, both research and experience. No comment question of the week today, because I feel like I have waffled on for a very long time and I don't want to take even more of your time, but hopefully this video gave you some good insight into effective quad training, and hopefully you can use it to enhance your personal training as well. Thank you for tolerating me, thank you for tolerating my vendetta against split squats, and thank you for tolerating the video.